Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to today's session of the Global Sustainability Author Webinar Series. So if you don't already know, Global Sustainability is an open access journal published by Cambridge University Press with Johan Rockstrom as editor-in-chief and a reputable supporting editorial team. We're delighted to be bringing you this webinar series thanks to our editors and authors. Today, we're joined by special guest speaker, Christoph Rupprecht, and in a moment, I'll hand over to Bert de Vries, Deputy Editor of Global Sustainability, who will introduce today's session. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You've all joined in listen-only mode, which means you'll be able to hear us, but not able to speak to us. However, you will have the opportunity to submit chat questions by typing your questions into the Q&A of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the webinar. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. If we are unable to get through all of the questions during the session, they will be included in the Q&A document that we will send after the webinar. Should you experience any technical issues, please add these to the questions box, and a member of the organizing team will endeavor to help you. In the unlikely event that we experience any issues, we will message the audience and restart the webinar. So to summarize, you can submit your questions at any time, and you'll also receive a survey at the end, so you can let us know how useful you found it. And this is another opportunity for you to ask any questions that you have. So to kick things off, I'd like to invite Bert de Vries, Deputy Editor of Global Sustainability.
Okay, thank you, Alison. Well, what we will hear about this afternoon is an attempt to define and apply multi-species sustainability, and I look forward to it. I think the paper published last year on the topic was an intelligent, I would say, an intelligent application of scenario design and attempts to come up with examples. Of course, the idea is not, let's say, very novel. In fact, if you look at 19th and 20th century romantic movements, they always resisted more modern and utilitarian approaches to nature. And if you just read some of the poems by someone like Wordsworth or reflections by someone like Nietzsche, you can see that many of them were struggling already with this whole idea of humans to be separated or distinguished even from the rest of nature. And it's quite fascinating, and in that sense, this topic is very timely, to see that things are now, in my view at least, rapidly changing, both in reality and in our minds. And I happen to be reading the last weeks the latest book by Bruno Latour, who 2 years ago wrote a booklet, Where to Land, and right now, or very recently, he wrote a book, Where Am I? And he makes this important observation that the pandemic and climate change are telling us that we can no longer live as separate humans on the planet. We consistently have to introduce the idea that we are also living from the planet. And in that sense, he posits extractionists, let's say, of modernity, against the people who do more inclusive thinking and acting. And I think today's lecture is a nice example of an attempt to systematically and conceptually start to have more inclusive thinking and acting about the human-nature relationship. So I look forward to the presentation and give the floor now to Christoph.
Thank you very much, Bert. Okay, let's get going. Thank you again for the introduction, Bert, and thank you to Global Sustainability for the opportunity of talking a little bit about the idea of multi-species sustainability today. A big thank you also to my 18 co-authors, without whom this paper would certainly not have happened. Let me start with a brief outline of the paper. So in this paper, we identify a crucial flaw in the definition of sustainability. We trace this flaw through major sustainability visualizations, and in trying to solve this flaw, we propose a new definition that recognizes the interdependence of human and non-human well-being. We then develop some principles to guide future sustainability strategies and look at possibilities at how multi-species sustainability might be applied. But let's start at the beginning. What's wrong with sustainability? What's wrong with sustainability is that this definition has not led to fixing the problem. We still fail to meet the needs of the present and compromise future generations' ability at the same time. As the chair of the IPBES noted in 2019, we are eroding the very foundations of our economies, livelihoods, food security, health, and quality of life worldwide. So what's going on? The first answer is obviously rampant extraction and exploitation of nature and people under capitalism and colonialism, and the pursuit of unlimited economic growth. But this has already been shown and discussed again and again. What we wanted to know is how the sustainability concept and sustainability science as a community didn't immediately run head-on into this topic. We wanted to know how so many ideas and initiatives can build on the sustainability concept, yet fail to deliver an end to ecological destruction, as has recently been shown even for the SDGs, which still rely on economic growth. At first glance, the extended definition of sustainability seems to provide a solid conceptual basis. But let's look at the second, rarely quoted part. Satisfaction of human needs as a major objective, relying on natural systems that support life on Earth. Let's look at how this definition has been visually represented, because hidden here are some vital pointers for the reasons we are struggling to achieve sustainability. In the original triple bottom line concept, we see people, planet, and profit on equal standing. The weak sustainability concept refines this and argues that we are looking at a trade-off problem. Economy, society, and environment are presented as exchangeable. One can be converted into or made up for by the others. The strong sustainability concept, however, diverges, and this is an important conceptual step. It acknowledges that without the environment, there would be no society. Without society, there would be no economy. Nevertheless, there's still a very strong reductionism going on that hides the diversity. There are indeed many environments, and some are suffering more than others. There are many societies, some more sustainable than others, some not even human. And there are many economies, some built on extraction and exploitation, some built on respecting life and sufficiency. We trace this tendency to oversimplify and look for neat categories to the human-nature dualism. Human-nature dualism is often associated with the philosopher Descartes and his strict separation of mind and body. In ways that we are often not aware of, this dualism is one way of making sense of the world. You and me, us and them, society and nature, subject and object. We draw lines because it makes things easier, because the figure on the left is much clearer and easier to understand. The only problem with this figure is that that is not how the world really works. Reality is much better described by the messy, chaotic mix of lines on the right. Whether we think about human relations or relations in an ecosystem, or even the relations between us and the bacteria in our gut, we are looking at complex entanglements. And as research on gut bacteria and the microbiome makes clear, it is surprisingly hard to even decide where the boundaries are between them and us. The more we learn about the world, the harder it becomes to simply draw a line to separate here and there. Fortunately, there are alternatives to this dualism and reductionism. Indeed, the societies and cultures with the best long-term track record of sustainability are overwhelmingly indigenous societies. And indigenous scholars, many of them cited here at the bottom of the slide, are at the forefront in research on relational perspectives. Together with work across a number of humanities, social sciences, and natural science fields, this change in thinking is rapidly reshaping our worldview. And here are some examples. For example, we now think that human nature is an interspecies relationship and that becoming is always about becoming with. As we have learned that even plants communicate and that indeed even cross-species communication is possible, we've come to face the fact that other than humans also have agency and are not merely machines that function according to given principles. From this research, multi-species thinking has emerged as a powerful framework for making sure we look at what's really going on in the world. It is part of a larger quest in the social sciences and humanities to replace dualist ontologies by relational perspectives. It highlights the intersections between ecological relations, political economy, and cultural representations. It emphasizes that understanding social and cultural phenomena requires recognition of the agency of non-human species, whether we are talking about plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, or viruses. It also emphasizes that entanglements with human lives, landscapes, and technologies must be theoretically integrated into any account of existence. And finally, humans and other life forms and their well-being are interconnected and inseparable. And with this last part, we have found a hint that we might be able to use to fix the reductionism that has affected sustainability efforts. So what we set out to do in the paper is to ask what a sustainability concept based in such relational thinking might look like. And here's our proposed new definition. Multi-species sustainability means meeting the diverse, changing, interdependent, and irreducibly inseparable needs of all species of the present, while enhancing the ability of future generations of all species to meet their own needs. Given that we used an analysis of ways sustainability has been visualized, we thought we'd try to reflect what sets multi-species sustainability apart. The conceptual model you can see here is focused on visualizing interdependence. So as we go nested to the center of the model, if an element is inside, it means it depends on the elements on the outside. And that's why in the very middle of the model, we find formal economies because they depend wholly on everything around them. In contrast, this conceptual model is focused on the shared agency that shapes the Earth system. And if we look at the different agents in this model, we will find that Homo sapiens, we humans, is only one agent amongst a vast array of species that are all forming the cities we live in, the landscapes we live in, the atmosphere we breathe, and even our own bodies. This definition of multi-species sustainability is based on 6 principles, which I would like to briefly outline. The first principle states that needs of one species cannot be met independently, but rather require needs of other species to be met. The state of 2 or more species interdependent needs being met can be called multi-species well-being. The second principle states that multi-species well-being emerges from and depends upon a set of complex relations shaped by the agency and the transformative potential of all members involved, even if this agency and potential is expressed in different ways. From this derives the need for multi-species stakeholders, especially stakeholders representing the needs of other species in human multi-stakeholder spaces. The third principle states that multi-species well-being exposes the logical fallacy of maximizing human well-being at the expense of others in a trade-off calculation. Well-being is relation-based, not resource-based, and thus it is not a zero-sum game. Meeting the needs of the present should therefore enhance, not compromise, the ability of future generations to meet their needs with the goal of increasing multi-species well-being over time. The fourth principle states that multi-species well-being is too complex to be controlled top-down. Following insights from cybernetics, in particularly Ashby's law of requisite variety, a management system requires equal or higher variety than the system it seeks to control. That means that diverse, changing, interdependent, and inseparable needs of multiple species possess extremely high variety, and anthropocentric management systems would thus require equal or higher variety to regulate in detail the complexity involved in achieving multi-species well-being. Effective management, therefore, requires participation of autonomous local multi-species actors. The fifth principle states that functioning management requires self-regulating systems. This calls for systems based on representations of and experimentations around continuously renegotiating complex, entangled multi-species interests. And such systems rely on and respect multi-species agency and aim to provide to all species the operational autonomy necessary to meet their needs. Many best practices in this regard have been developed by indigenous peoples and are already part of traditional ecological knowledge systems. And finally, sustainability requires the ability to anticipate what the future might bring. Multi-species well-being combines the different ways of anticipating futures that exist among different species, while seeking to employ the specific anticipatory capacities of the human species for better futures for the entire Earth system. Now, that was quite a bit. So at this point, you might say, yes, okay, very nice. But what difference would changing the definition of sustainability make? For this purpose, we did a thought experiment. We have two axes, sustainable to unsustainable, and anthropocentric versus multi-species orientation. And this gives us 4 scenarios. Today, we sit firmly in the bottom left, a race to the bottom, focused on human needs, and very clearly unsustainable. Now, if we start to care about other species without addressing sustainability, we get to the top left. We're left with dry-aging species extinctions, or we risk sliding into eco-fascism, where nature needs to be protected from those with a different skin color or culture from us. In the bottom right, we find traditional sustainability, where natural systems serve human well-being as nothing more than a factory of ecosystem services. In practice, what this means is trying to perfectly monitor the planetary boundaries to maximize consumption, which of course would need to be rationalized and enforced to avoid overshoot. That leaves us with the top right scenario, where thinking sustainability in terms of interdependent needs means well-being needs to be largely mutual. The ideas most closely aligned appear to be degrowth and post-development, sufficiency-oriented economies that provide space for non-human autonomy, but also concepts such as biocultural diversity that emphasize how separating humans from nature in, say, a half-Earth approach ignores how many cultures have thrived together with their surrounding ecosystems. Now, in the last part, I will briefly showcase 2 ways we can see multi-species sustainability might be useful in a policy context. First, we look at the case of multi-species stakeholders, as mentioned in the second principle. In research, colleagues and I did around Japanese honeybee beekeeping research, we came to the conclusion that wildlife, stewards, the public, and governance are 4 key stakeholder groups required for human-wildlife coexistence. Indeed, if you talk to Japanese honeybee beekeepers, they see often bees as partners in co-creating the landscape, not as livestock to be controlled. They also play a vital role in monitoring bee and ecosystem health and in conveying multi-species needs to society. So based on the donut economics model, we sought to visualize and visually represent these interdependencies and intervention points to enable holistic policy making. And in the figure on the right, you can see that for all of the 4 stakeholders, there exist conditions in the forms of a socio-ecological ceiling that shouldn't be crossed, and in the form of a socio-ecological foundation that needs to be present. In the second case, colleagues from the Healthy Urban Microbiome Initiative are currently aiming to improve public health through ecosystem restoration based on recognizing the human microbe environment link. The initiative emphasizes our body as being in constant exchange with our surroundings. And from this starting point, devises interventions, such as a microbiome-friendly green infrastructure that increases overall multi-species well-being. With that, we're already at the end of my presentation, so I'd like to recap some key points. What multi-species sustainability does is it replaces the flawed reductionism with an awareness of interdependence and with a commitment to joint flourishing. It tries to synthesize indigenous knowledges, insights from cybernetics and insights from multi-species studies. And it does that to focus on a relational perspective, to focus on non-human agency and the operational autonomy of multi-species stakeholders. And we think it's not only relevant for policymaking, but it's also relevant for everyone to reimagine their own relations. And with that, we are at the end of the talk, but before we dive into the Q&A session, allow me to pitch our new science fiction anthology, where we try to reimagine cities in the Asia Pacific based on a multi-species sustainability concept. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you, Christoph, for this interesting presentation. I think it could potentially raise many, many questions. Personally, I think it's very important that scientists work nowadays on novel conceptual frameworks in order to give a place to the many, many initiatives which are being taken place at the moment in the world, like the 2 examples you have here. So I think that's very important. And at the same time, looking at the scenarios, and I don't see right now any questions. So I will ask my own question, just one out of quite a few, which is that we also have, of course, people who care about other species, but who come up with quite different futures, which are much more optimistic than what you suggest in the upper left corner or the lower right corner. You know, the eco-modernist manifesto, I guess.
Yes.
And we also, in relation to climate change, have now these discussions about genetic engineering, or I should say geoengineering. And in relation to biodiversity, we have discussions on genetic engineering. So we have a whole crew of usually well-funded and powerful people who think that despite the fact that technologies have brought us in the present situation, we can still get out by applying new, novel, exciting technologies. And one example is, as I recently read, experiments to preserve biodiversity by something like co-supporting evolution with genetic engineering. And another example are, of course, the geoengineering efforts to see if we can, let's say, rescue the animals and the plants from the climate change we are bringing forth. So my question is, how would you see, or how would you reply to those people if they come up with this kind of optimism?
Thank you for your question. I think that's a very good question because, as you have mentioned, like these ideas are more or less being presented daily, and they are very, very heatedly discussed in many different forums. And I would respond with a couple of points. The first being that it never ceases to amaze me how much energy, and by energy I mean not just energy in terms of of brain time, but also in terms of funding, etc., goes into incredibly complex and uncertain proposed solutions. And geoengineering is a very good example because, well, all of the equations and all of the modeling involved is incredibly complex, and it is also extremely difficult to do experimentation in these with these kind of things and then extrapolate from there to a global scale. When the alternative solutions proposed by, say, for example, the degrowth or post-development folks, I've kind of plugged here on the top right, are much, much more simple, have been tested. For example, if we look at traditional ecological management, tested and proven over thousands of years. So it makes me ask the question, why is that the case that we are tempted to put our hopes into baskets that are still under development, that might come along in the future? I mean, we've seen it now again in the US with President Biden arguing that the solutions that we need will be developed, but have not been developed yet, but surely they're coming soon. When there are other solutions that we could be picking that are right there. And I get the impression that this is happening because some of the solutions that we already have would imply changing a lot of the systems that currently work very well for an increasingly small number of very powerful people. It would mean getting rid of capitalism. It would mean coming to heeds with decades and centuries of colonialism. And that is, well, probably not very enjoyable, but it seems like a much better strategy than, well, as Bezos has just proposed, to lift all of our heavy industry into space. I'm not sure, but like it just seems that it wouldn't pass peer review, if you allow me to use a scientific language here. So I don't know if that directly answers your question, but of course, geoengineering in that regard is slightly different from eco-modernism, and that is different from some of the other, for example, the biological engineering. But I think all of these options have one thing in common, and that is that they vastly overestimate how well we understand the Earth system, how well we understand the biological foundations of life. And fields of research like microbiome are really showing us how little we understand and how much there is yet to discover. So I think these insights should really make us very, very humble when it comes to questions like, can we operate, can we be managers of the Earth system or not?
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, thank you. I think we would largely agree. I think the lower left corner is typically what critical people would call the area of hubris, and where the technological optimists think the solution will be there and all your dystopias in the lower left corner will not happen. I tend to agree fully with you. I think that we indeed have hubris in this respect. But the last sentence, one of the last sentences you made, implies, when you talked about the role of a small, powerful elite, implies that much of the agenda of your proposal is actually political in nature. And I'm wondering how you see the actual political ventures which could operationalize your attempt to move mostly towards the upper right corner. We had similar discussions in the Resilience Alliance, because this is already a topic when the social ecological systems of a smaller scale are researched, because then you still have this somewhat micro world where you can still think that it's possible to make this move by starting experiments. Of course, for the world at large, we are now in a situation, partly from our own interventions, that you really wonder how we can still go in these directions with these 7-8 billion people who are going to suffer from climate change. So I wonder, do you have any, let's say, operational political recommendations to move to that upper right corner where cooperation, for example, is much more important than we have in the present market-based capitalism, where the value of solidarity has to be restored with all its connotations of earlier socialism and communism, etc. So do you have specific ideas and experiences in this area?
Well, firstly, I think you very correctly identified that this is very much a political topic. And I think that's a very important point to make and to dwell upon, because a lot of, well, discussion has been around the question whether, for example, climate science is political or should be politicized, etc. I mean, my scientific background is partly in urban planning, and in cities, I don't think anyone would say that urban planning is not political. It's just so very obvious. So I found it always quite weird that if we try to plan like on a global scale and for environmental management, that somehow should not be political. I mean, it's obviously political because it's a choice of where we want to go. And in regard to your question, whether I have any ideas of, well, how we should try to get, for example, to the top right of this graph here, I think that's a very difficult question. And I think there are different paths, actually. So I only drew one here, one arrow, but I think there are probably many arrows here. And there are some arrows that probably imply more human and non-human suffering than others. One of the potential pathways has recently been pointed out by Kim Stanley Robinson in his book, Ministry for the Future. And in the book in itself, well, kind of tried to point out one such pathway to dealing with climate change and to find our way to a new system. And let's just say the different elements brought up in the book were very, very diverse. It included the central banks of the world, which are probably not known as the most progressive or left-leaning actors. But it also included straight out violent terrorism against airplanes to reduce, well, to keep people from flying. it reduced, it included terrorist attacks on private planes, which basically shocked me because Kim Stanley Robinson usually is a very, very optimistic humanist thinker. I don't see an armed uprising or revolution starting tomorrow. That would be maybe the classic 20th century solution. But I would also point out that all different kinds of struggles are already happening and are not something that we need to wait for. There are people out there every day trying to make this transition happening. A lot of them are indigenous people. A lot are environmental activists who have some of the highest death rates in the world because they are actively being killed by state and corporate interests. And as the recent climate events have shown, it's not a question of, well, at some point, will it turn bad or not? I think we're past that point. I think we've seen it's already very bad. And that makes kind of waiting to see how things might go down a very, very dangerous proposition. I personally think that democracy is something that's very worth holding on to, but I don't think democracy would actually need to necessarily be paired with markets. I think, for example, computational capacity has increased a lot, and that puts planned economies back on the table. Our paper has drawn partially on insights from cybernetics, and there's currently a lot of very interesting research going on in that regard that tries to bring, well, good management together with democratic management and together with an economy that serves the needs of the people and not the need to extract more profit.
Yeah, if I may interrupt you, I don't want to push further myself, but I've seen that there are two questions which now showed up and which are close to my own question, which both have to do with what are the practical examples, how to operationalize it. So if you see the questions, could you more or less build on your previous statement to give answers to these questions about more practical, more operational aspects?
Yes, so I'll start about in regard to the operationalization and the practical aspects by looking back again at the multi-species stakeholder policy framework. So in this policy framework, we look at the question of human-wildlife coexistence, and obviously cities is one of the areas where there's a lot of work that needs to be done because currently cities are still very focused on human well-being, but they could be reimagined and redesigned to provide habitat and space for non-human inhabitants as well. And they could indeed, as I think it was the C40 initiative has put it, cities could become good neighbors in the regional landscape and in the ecosystem. They could contribute instead of producing ecological destruction. And in this case here of the donut, we've worked with bees as an example, but I don't think this needs to be limited to bees. I think the multi-species stakeholder approach can be directly applied in urban planning. And I have a very nice slide here that I can share. Second. So this is a method that a colleague of mine who's also a co-author, Natalie Osborne, is already using in her university courses where she trains the planners of the next generation. And what's happening here is that the students enter into multi-species negotiations. Say you have a development in a place, in a city, a very concrete example that happens every day in many cities around the world. And by bringing in multi-species stakeholder, all of a sudden you have very new experiences, you have very new perspectives that are being integrated into the discussion. And that might very well change outcomes dramatically. And of course, you can also try to think this on a city level. You can try to see what kind of multi-species capacity, you might call it, does the current urban planning system have, and how can we increase that? How can we systematically go through all of the different policy levers that make cities tick to increase their way to work towards multi-species well-being? And cities are just one example there. This can be done with other policy as well. So I hope that answers Alicia's question. I see there's also a question by Naho Iguchi, which is around applying the theory to an actual project and developing a method to implement multi-species sustainability. So I think the multi-species planning approach here would be one example. I can also quickly share some slides for a project that I've tried to do together with a landscape designer. And so this is still kind of very, very early work. And we're very far still from pushing the multi-species idea as far as I think it can go. And this is forthcoming in a book that should be out, well, hopefully sometime this year. And what we did was, we work in the context of Japanese cities. Japanese cities, except Tokyo and Nagoya, are projected to shrink in terms of population, which will lead to lots of vacant lots across the city, because cities don't neatly shrink into itself, but they stay as they are, and then people move away. And you can see how damaging that can be in places like Detroit, for example, is a standard example. But we think this can also have a potential for kind of, well, it provides space that is not captured by capitalism. And this space can be used to put it into use for multi-species well-being. So what we try to think through is this concept where instead of having an individual garden or your standard community garden, we take a lot and we actively anticipate the depopulation and the post-growth environment, and we take the multi-species agency and integrate it into the design concept. We try to work with some of the kind of standard thinking around ecological cycles, but we also try to incorporate some of the social aspects where the space is neither fully private and neither fully public. And we try to think about the time axis as well. So we start out with a space that is still kind of more human focused maybe in the beginning, but people age, for example. That means as they age, they may not be as eager to plant vegetables in the sun anymore. So some of the space could be actively abandoned and be given over to, for example, self-rewilding. And the whole place is ecologically designed to provide habitat to as many species as possible. So this is one example of a design that has not been implemented yet, but that we would very much like try to implement, and but where we try to actually actively think through a multi-species sustainability or multi-species urban design approach on the site level, in a concrete space. So this was designed for a site that we have in the outskirts of Kyoto. And I hope that is kind of one example. Of course, the other project is the one that I briefly talked about earlier. That's the science fiction anthology we published in April, which takes aim at the fact that it's very hard to imagine a different world, but as scientists, we don't need to do all of this ourselves. We can work with creators, we can work with writers whose job it is to come up with new ideas. And this was, to be honest, one of the most exciting collaborations I've ever done. And I can only warmly recommend not only checking out the book, which is available for very, very cheap without DRM, but also if you work in, say, any field of science to go out and collaborate with people you usually don't collaborate with, because it's definitely worth it.
Well, thank you, Christoph. I think that was a very nice addition to your talk. I am wondering if you know this website, Seeds of Anthropocene, because many of these experiments or small scale initiatives or eco-communities or whatever you call them, it's very important that we make a list, like also Naomi Klein is doing, I think, on one of her websites, because this is basically, as I see it, the fuel, you might say also the seed, indeed, of the direction we have to go. So I enjoyed this part particularly. I may have one last question myself, because I don't see any new questions. It's a somewhat more personal one, because I am interested always in terms of worldviews to look for compromises, to look for dialogue, and then get the other parties into the game, into the dialogue. And you may know, we recently had in the Netherlands, but even more in Germany and Belgium, these heavy floodings only a few days ago. And there was a lot of discussion in the Netherlands about what we call Room for the River project. And this is a project which started after the serious floods, something like 25 years ago. So I'm wondering, the interesting thing to me is here that the water engineers really use the language of engineering. And what they try to do is to make sure that the water itself, if you have floods, has enough room to go into larger spaces. And I was wondering, do you see any connection here or potential approaches in which we combine this, let's say, water engineering stuff with your multi-species approach? Could you imagine or perhaps give examples?
Yes, so it's actually quite straightforward because in our paper, we use the term multi-species, and we focus really on species interactions mostly. But in this, like in many things, indigenous science is already ahead of Western science. And in indigenous knowledges, agency is usually not limited to living things. So, for example, in the Maori worldview, you have the ocean, you have rivers, and they have agency. And I think if you think about a river in terms not just of like water going from place A to place B, but in terms of something that has agency to shape and change the world, that connects very, very nicely with the idea of maybe giving this entity space to expand at one time or another. And I've seen in different places people use similar framings, for example, to, I believe, I can't remember the name of the person who did it, but it was a really interesting presentation I heard about dealing not just with flooding, but also with storms in, I think it was in India, and conceptualizing the storm as something that will appear in one form or another at one time or another, and that definitely has the agency to change your whole world. And we've had very bad landslides in Japan recently. And I think as we see the natural world around us shifting, we can again use some of the kind of framings and stories and ways to make sense of the world that have been used for a long time, not necessarily to explain the exact things that are going on there, but to help us come to terms with the fact that the river may not always be exactly where we want it to be. And that will help us to come up with mechanisms of coping. So in a special issue on degrowth for the Japanese Landscape Institute journal that we did 2 years ago, we had a very interesting paper from a senior scholar who argued that there has been very, very sophisticated flood management been done in Japan in the Edo period, so say 100, 200, 300 years ago. And that was not necessarily focused on controlling the river, but that was focused on social mechanisms of coping, of making sure that if somebody loses their house or livelihood, not everything is over. It's this clinging to certain things, this kind of way that people can drop off and lose everything, that focus that kind of fuels our need to control. I think once we can be ensured that we will be fine, then we also might have an easier time of letting go and being fine with not being in control.
Well, thank you. That last remark is also, of course, a crucial one, the quest for control. But in line with the comment I see here from Alicia, which says, cool to see the multi-species stakeholder planning with the mask. I think we might conclude by suggesting at least that if we have these big projects in, let's say, urbanized and densely populated countries, we should add something like an artist ecologist or something like this, someone who brings in both the knowledge of ecosystems and, like Bruno Latour is also experimenting with in France, and the attitude or even theatrical capabilities to play that role on behalf of non-human species. So perhaps I should give you the last word, Christoph, and then hand it over to Alison, because I don't see any other questions. So please, Christoph, if you have one closure remark, you're welcome.
Yes, I would like to use the closure remark to again say thank you to all of the co-authors and to the journal for making this happen, but also to say thank you to one of the case studies that we used in the paper, which is the Project for the Love of Bees, which does exactly what you just said. So this is a bee project that does not just teach beekeeping, but that actually uses an artistic vision of imagining your city as the safest city in the world for bees. And from that point on, from this bee as a lens thing, goes on to do beekeeping workshops, but also working towards a more bee-friendly city, to community garden, to citizen science. So it all branches out from there. And I think this is happening because there are scientists and citizens and artists and so many different people involved. And the folks behind For the Love of Bees have taught us a lot, and we've had very many good conversations. So I would really like to use this opportunity to say thank you also to them. And thanks for having me today.
All right, well, thank you for giving this presentation, which was interesting and inspiring. And I'll give now the floor back to Alison.
Yeah, and I'd also like to echo Bert and thank Christoph for his time and taking part. I really hope you've all enjoyed the webinar and found it useful to hear from Christoph and to learn more about the journal. We're taking a break for webinars over the summer, but we're planning to kick off the series again from the autumn. So do keep an eye on the Global Sustainability Author Webinars page for forthcoming webinars. And thank you very much for attending. Thank you.